"I'm sorry Marcus cheated you," Robert said, and he genuinely meant it. "But I can't give up property I bought legally. There has to be another solution." Helena studied his face for a long moment, as if weighing something important. "Maybe there is," she said finally. "But first, you need to understand exactly what you've bought and what it took to build it. Then we can talk about what comes next." As the afternoon sun began to sink toward the horizon, Robert realized his simple plan to start a new life had become infinitely more complicated. But looking at these three determined women and the obvious care they'd put into the land, he began to wonder if complicated might not necessarily mean bad. The contract Helena pulled from her jacket pocket looked official enough to make Robert's mouth go dry. Even from several feet away, he could make out what appeared to be signatures, dates, and an official notary seal at the bottom. His mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. "You're bluffing," Robert said, though his voice lacked conviction. "No legitimate contract would give you ownership rights that supersede a legal deed." Helena unfolded the document with deliberate care, and Robert stepped closer to examine it. The paper was thick, expensive, with multiple signatures clearly visible alongside official stamps. But as Robert read the terms, his confusion deepened rather than clearing. "This is a business partnership agreement," he said, looking up at Helena. "For agricultural operations, profit sharing, and double quotes." He paused at a particularly detailed clause. "Exclusive development rights with option to purchase." "Keep reading," Ruth said quietly, moving to stand beside Robert as he studied the document. Her proximity was distracting. She smelled like fresh earth and something floral, and there was a competence in her manner that commanded respect. Robert's heart sank as he reached the final clauses. According to the contract, Marcus Vance had granted the three women exclusive rights to develop and operate the agricultural business on the property for a period of 5 years, with an option to purchase the land at a predetermined price at the end of that term. More damaging still, the agreement specified that any sale of the property during the contract period would transfer Marcus's obligations to the new owner. "This can't be legally binding," Robert said, but his business experience told him it probably was. The language was precise, the terms specific, and the notarization looked legitimate. Magdalene stepped forward, her red hair catching the afternoon light. Marcus was a lawyer before he decided to try farming. He knew exactly what he was doing when he drafted that contract. And he knew exactly what he was doing when he sold the land without telling us. "When did you last hear from him?" Robert asked, a sinking feeling growing in his stomach. 3 weeks ago, Helena replied. "He said he was going to town for supplies." Next thing we knew, strangers were asking questions about the property, and someone had filed transfer papers at the county courthouse. Ruth pulled out a worn leather journal and handed it to Robert. "This documents every improvement we've made, every dollar we've invested, every hour of labor. Marcus contributed the initial land purchase and agreed to handle the paperwork. We contributed everything else." Robert flipped through the journal, amazed by the detailed records. Receipts for materials, photographs showing the progression of improvements, detailed notes about soil preparation and crop rotation. These women had transformed the property from rough rangeland into a sophisticated agricultural operation. "The solar panels alone cost us $8,000, Magdalene said, pointing toward the array that powered the irrigation pumps. "The greenhouse was another $6,000. The root cellar, the composting system, the fence repairs, we've invested everything we had. And now Marcus has disappeared with the money from selling. I'll work to you," Helena added, her voice tight with controlled anger. Robert felt sick. "How much did he sell it to me for?" "According to the county records, $47,000, Ruth said quietly. "For land we transformed from worthless scrub into productive farmland worth twice that amount. The pieces were falling into place, creating a picture that made Robert feel like both victim and unwitting accomplice. Marcus Vance had used these women's labor and investment to improve his property, then sold it for a profit without compensating them or honoring his contractual obligations. "There's something else," Helena said, her expression growing darker. "Marcus didn't just steal from us. He borrowed money using this property as collateral, money he was supposed to use for expanding the operation. That loan comes due in 6 weeks." Robert's blood ran cold. "How much?" $15,000. "And if it's not paid, the bank can foreclose on the entire property." The revelation hit Robert like a physical blow. Not only was his ownership of the property legally questionable, but there was a significant debt attached that could wipe out his investment entirely. Marcus Vance hadn't just cheated these women. He'd set up Robert to lose everything. "You didn't know, did you?" Ruth said, studying his face with something that might have been sympathy. "Marcus assured me the property was free and clear." Robert said numbly, "I have title insurance, but that won't cover debts that predate my purchase." Magdalene laughed bitterly. Marcus was very good at telling people what they wanted to hear. It's how he convinced us to trust him in the first place. As the full scope of his situation became clear, Robert felt anger replacing his initial shock. He'd been played by a con man who had used legal expertise to create an elaborate fraud. But the anger wasn't directed at these 3 women who were as much victims as he was. "We need to see what our options are," Robert said finally. "All of us. Because Marcus Vance screwed us all." Helena studied his face carefully. "You're not what we expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone who would try to throw us off the land without listening to our side of the story. Someone who would choose legal technicalities over doing what's right." Robert looked around at the evidence of their work, the obvious care they'd invested in the property. "I came here to start over, to build something meaningful. I can't do that by destroying what you've already built." For the first time since his arrival, the tension in the air began to shift. These women weren't his enemies. They were fellow victims of Marcus Vance's deception. And if they were going to solve this mess, they'd have to work together. "So what do we do now?" Robert asked. Helena exchanged glances with her partners before answering. "We figure out how to save what we've all invested in this place. And we make sure Marcus Vance pays for what he's done." As the sun continued its descent toward the horizon, Robert realized his simple plan for a quiet new life had evolved into something far more complex. But looking at these 3 determined women and the obvious skill they'd brought to the land, he began to think that complexity might lead to something better than anything he could have built alone. The deed felt heavier than it should have in Robert Whitmore's weathered hands as he stared at the farmhouse that was supposed to be empty. 3 women stood on the porch like sentinels, their tall frames casting long shadows across the wooden planks. The leader, a woman with steel-gray hair and arms that spoke of years of hard labor, stepped forward with a smile that didn't reach her cold blue eyes. "You must be the new owner," she said, her voice carrying the weight of someone accustomed to getting her way. But there was something else in her tone, something that made the hair on Robert's neck stand up. The other 2 women flanked her sides, equally imposing, watching him with the intensity of guards protecting their territory. Robert had traveled 3 days through rough terrain to reach this remote property in northern Montana. His life savings were invested in what the seller promised was fertile land, perfect for cattle ranching. The isolation had been part of the appeal, a chance to start fresh away from the complications of his failed marriage and the corporate job that had slowly crushed his spirit. Now, standing in the dusty yard with these 3 strangers claiming his space, that isolation felt more like a trap. "Ladies, I think there's been some confusion," Robert said, keeping his voice steady despite the unease crawling up his spine. "This is my property now. I have the legal documents right here." He held up the deed, the official seal still crisp and new from the county courthouse. The woman's smile widened, but it wasn't friendly. "Oh, We know exactly who you are, Robert Whitmore. We've been expecting you. The way she said his name sent a chill through him. How did she know who he was? The seller had assured him the transaction was private, that no one else knew about the purchase. We've been living here for quite some time. The second woman spoke up, her voice deeper than her companion's. She had dark hair streaked with silver, and hands stained with what looked like engine grease. Taking care of the land, keeping it productive. She emphasized the last word in a way that made Robert's stomach tighten with unease. The third woman, a redhead with freckles that dotted her weathered face, let out a low laugh. The previous owner made certain arrangements with us before he left. Arrangements that don't just disappear because of a piece of paper. Robert felt the weight of their stares like physical pressure against his chest. These weren't ordinary squatters or confused neighbors. There was something deliberate about their presence, something calculated that made him question everything about his purchase. The seller, Marcus Vance, had been eager to close the deal quickly, almost suspiciously so. Had he walked into some kind of setup? What kind of arrangements? Robert asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. The tall woman's eyes glittered with something that wasn't quite amusement. The kind that involve you understanding how things really work out here, Mr. Whitmore. She paused, letting the words sink in before delivering the blow that would change everything. You see, we have as much claim to this land as that piece of paper gives you. Maybe more. The words hit him like a physical blow, not from any physical threat, but from the sheer confidence they carried. This wasn't simple trespassing. These women believed they had legitimate rights to his property, and the way they stood, the conviction in their voices, made him wonder if they might be right. But what exactly was he walking into? And why did he have the sinking feeling that his deed might not be worth the paper it was written on? Robert's hand instinctively moved toward the rifle secured to his horse's saddle, but he stopped himself. Violence wouldn't solve this, and something told him these women were prepared for confrontation. Instead, he forced himself to think like the businessman he'd been for 15 years before buying this land. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, Robert said, forcing steel into his voice despite the uncertainty churning in his gut. But I paid good money for this land, and I'm not going anywhere. He dismounted slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. While maintaining eye contact with the leader Don, the tall woman chuckled, a sound devoid of warmth. Game? Oh, Robert, this isn't a game at all. This is about justice. She gestured toward the farmhouse with a sweep of her muscular arm. You see, the man who sold you this property didn't own it free and clear. There are debts, obligations, improvements we made that were never compensated. As Robert looked more closely at the property, he began to notice details he'd missed during his initial excitement about the purchase. The irrigation ditches that ran in precise lines across the fields. The well-maintained fences that showed recent repair work. The garden plots that were clearly tended with expert care. Someone had invested serious time and labor into this place. The dark-haired woman stepped forward, her boots heavy on the porch steps. My name's Helena Morrison. This is Ruth Chun and Magdalene Foster. She nodded toward her companions. We've been working this land for the past 2 years, turning it from a neglected piece of scrub into something productive. Marcus Vance may have held the title, but we built everything you see here. Ruth stepped down from the porch, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who knew every inch of the property. We designed and dug the irrigation system. We cleared the fields, improved the soil, built relationships with suppliers and buyers. Marcus provided the initial investment, but we provided everything else. And now he's run off with the profits from selling our work, Magdalene added, her green eyes flashing with anger that seemed both fresh and long simmering. Robert felt the first real stab of uncertainty. Marcus Vance had been vague about the property's history, mentioning only that he'd decided ranching wasn't for him and wanted to sell to someone who would appreciate the land's potential. He'd never mentioned partners or improvements made by others. Even if that's true, Robert said carefully, whatever arrangement you had with Marcus Vance doesn't legally bind me. I bought this property in good faith. Helena's expression hardened. Good faith? That's rich. Let me ask you something, Mr. Whitmore. When you toured this property, did Marcus mention the solar panel system that powers the water pumps? The root cellar that keeps vegetables fresh year-round? The contracts with 3 different suppliers who rely on our produce? As she spoke, Robert began to see details he'd attributed to Marcus's good stewardship. The efficient layout of the outbuildings, the sophisticated composting system, the greenhouse that extended the growing season. These weren't the marks of a casual landowner. They showed planning, expertise, and significant investment of time and labor. Marcus showed me around for about an hour, Robert admitted. He said he'd made some improvements, but was ready to move on. Some improvements, Ruth repeated bitterly. 2 years of our lives, every dollar we could scrape together. And now a stranger shows up with a piece of paper saying it all belongs to him. The weight of the situation began to settle on Robert's shoulders. These women weren't random squatters trying to take advantage of him. They were people who had genuinely invested in this land and been betrayed by his seller. But that didn't change the fact that he'd paid his life savings for property he legally owned. The question was whether they could find enough evidence before the bank loan came due, and they lost everything. 3 days later, Robert spread a collection of documents across the kitchen table in the farmhouse, creating what looked like a detective's evidence board. Helena sat across from him, nursing a cup of coffee while Ruth and Magdalene flanked them, all 4 studying the growing pile of evidence they'd assembled against Marcus Vance. The equipment lien was definitely fraudulent, Ruth announced, hanging up the phone after a lengthy conversation with Cascade Equipment Company. They have no record of any deliveries to this address, and the serial numbers Marcus listed on the lien documents don't match any equipment in their inventory system. Robert made a note on his legal pad. That's 1 down. What about the Mountain Valley Development lien? Magdalene pulled out a printed document. I drove to the Nevada Secretary of State's office in Carson City yesterday. Mountain Valley Development Corporation was registered 3 months ago, with Marcus Vance listed as the sole owner and director. The business address is a mailbox service in Las Vegas, so he created a fake company to bill himself for fake services, Helena said grimly, then filed a lien against property he was planning to sell to make it look like legitimate debt. It gets worse, Robert added, consulting his own notes. I traced the bank routing number from the invoices Marcus provided to First National. The money didn't go to any agricultural equipment company. It was transferred to a personal account registered to someone named Michael Vaughn. Ruth looked up sharply. Michael Vaughn was the name on some mail Marcus received early on. He said it was a business partner, but we never met him. Because Michael Vaughn is Marcus Vance, Robert concluded. Same initials, similar name. He set up an alternate identity to receive the loan money, then probably transferred it to accounts outside Montana. Helena stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the irrigation system she'd designed and built. So Marcus created fake companies, fake invoices, and fake identities to steal money from the bank, and then disappeared, leaving us all holding the bag. The question is whether we can prove it in time to save the property, Magdalene said. The bank loan comes due in 5 weeks. Robert had been thinking about this problem for days. David Chun seemed receptive when we showed him the initial evidence. If we can provide solid proof that Marcus obtained the loan fraudulently, the bank might be willing to discharge the debt rather than foreclose on property that would be difficult to sell with these complications. What about the money Marcus stole from the sale? Ruth asked. $47,000 should be enough to pay off the legitimate debts and give us all a fresh start. That's where things get more complicated, Robert admitted. Even if we prove Marcus committed fraud, recovering the money could take years of litigation. In the meantime, we still have immediate financial obligations. Alana turned back to the group, her expression thoughtful. There might be another way. The partnership agreement I signed with Marcus gives us the right to purchase the property at fair market value. If we can prove the land is worth more than what you paid for it, Robert, we might be able to restructure the deal. Robert had been studying the partnership agreement extensively. The purchase option is based on an agricultural appraisal of the improved property. Given all the work you've done, that appraisal could be significantly higher than the $47,000 I paid. How much higher? Magdalene asked. I contacted an agricultural appraiser in Billings, Ruth said, pulling out another document. Based on the photographs and improvement documentation I provided, his preliminary estimate is $75,000 to $80,000 for the current property value. The number hung in the air as everyone processed its implications. If the property was worth $75,000 and Robert had paid $47,000, there was potentially $28,000 in equity that could be used to resolve the debt situation. Here's what I'm thinking, Robert said slowly. What if we formalize a partnership? You three have the agricultural expertise and sweat equity in the improvements. I have the legal ownership and some remaining capital. Together, we might be able to restructure everything and come out ahead. Helena studied his face carefully. What kind of partnership are you talking about? Equal ownership, shared decision-making, and profits split based on contribution and effort. We use the property's increased value to pay off the legitimate bank debt, and we all have legal protection going forward. Ruth leaned forward, interested. Would that give us security if something like this happens again? It would give all of us legal standing and clear ownership rights. No one could sell the property without everyone's consent, and any debts would require all partners' approval. Magdalene looked skeptical. Why would you want to partner with us? You could probably fight the liens and keep the property for yourself. Robert had been asking himself the same question. The logical business decision would be to minimize his exposure and protect his individual interests. But logic wasn't the only factor he was considering, because I've seen what you've built here, he said honestly. I'm a decent businessman, but I don't know anything about agriculture. You've turned this land into something productive and sustainable. I'd rather own a quarter of something successful than all of something I probably mismanage. Helena exchanged glances with Ruth and Magdalene before responding. We'd need to see the specific terms, but the principle sounds fair. The question is whether we can make it work legally and financially. I've been researching partnership structures, Robert said, pulling out a folder of documents. There are several options that would protect everyone's interests and provide clear guidelines for decision-making and profit-sharing. As they continued discussing the details, Robert felt something he hadn't experienced since his divorce. The possibility of building something meaningful with people who shared his values and work ethic. These women had proven their commitment to the land and their ability to work together. Maybe what Marcus Vance had intended as a betrayal could become the foundation for something better than any of them could achieve alone. There's one more thing we need to discuss, Helena said as the conversation wound down. Marcus Vance is still out there, and he's stolen money from all of us. Even if we solve our immediate problems, he could try the same scheme on other people. Robert nodded grimly. David Chun mentioned that the bank is considering filing criminal charges if we can provide enough evidence. And the State Attorney General's office has a fraud investigation unit that handles cases like this. So we're not just trying to save our property, Ruth said. We're trying to stop Marcus from doing this to anyone else. Exactly. And the more evidence we can gather, the better our chances of both recovering our losses and putting him in prison where he belongs. As the afternoon light began to fade, Robert looked around the table at his unlikely partners. What had started as a property dispute had evolved into a complex financial investigation, but it had also revealed something unexpected: the possibility of building a life and business with people who shared his peace, determination to fight for what was right. The question now was whether they could gather enough evidence to stop Marcus Vance before he disappeared completely with their money and their dreams. Robert's phone rang at 6:30 in the morning, jolting him awake in the spare bedroom Helena had reluctantly offered him in the farmhouse. It was David Chun from the bank, and the urgency in his voice immediately cleared Robert's head. "We've got him," David said without preamble. Marcus Vance tried to apply for another agricultural loan yesterday, using a property in Wyoming as collateral. When the loan officer called to verify the property details, it turns out Marcus doesn't actually own it. Robert sat up, fully alert now. Where is he? The loan application came from a bank in Cheyenne. The address he provided was for a hotel, but when Wyoming authorities checked, he'd already left. However, they did find something interesting in his hotel room. Helena appeared in the doorway, clearly having overheard the conversation. Robert gestured for her to sit down as he put the phone on speaker. What did they find? Robert asked. Documents related to at least 3 other properties in Montana, Colorado, and Wyoming. It looks like Marcus has been running this same scam across multiple states. The FBI is now involved because he's been crossing state lines to commit fraud. Helena leaned forward. Did they find any trace of the money he stole from us? That's where it gets interesting. The FBI agent I spoke with said they found bank account information for several different identities Marcus has been using. They're working with banks to freeze the accounts, but it's going to take time to trace all the money. Robert felt a surge of hope mixed with frustration. The authorities were finally taking action, but recovering their stolen money could still take months or years. There's something else, David continued. The FBI wants to interview all of you about your experiences with Marcus. They're building a case that could put him away for decades, but they need victim testimony to establish the pattern of fraud. After David hung up, Helena called Ruth and Magdalene to the kitchen, where they spent the next hour discussing their next steps. The prospect of testifying against Marcus was both satisfying and daunting. It meant reliving the betrayal, but it also meant ensuring he faced justice. Agent Sarah Williams from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit will be here this afternoon, Helena announced after speaking with the investigators. She wants to interview each of us separately and examine all the documentation we've gathered. Robert spent the morning organizing their evidence into clear chronological order, while Ruth and Magdalene worked on creating a comprehensive inventory of all the improvements they'd made to the property. By the time Agent Williams arrived, they had assembled a compelling case that demonstrated both the scope of Marcus's deception and the significant damages he'd caused. Agent Williams was younger than Robert had expected, probably in her early 30s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing as she examined their documentation. She interviewed each of them separately, asking detailed questions about their interactions with Marcus and carefully documenting every promise he'd made and broken. This is one of the most sophisticated agricultural fraud schemes I've seen, she told them when the interviews were complete. Marcus Vance has been using the same basic pattern across 4 states, targeting both individual investors and small communities, where people are more likely to trust their neighbors. How many other victims are there? Magdalene asked. At least 12 that we know of, probably more. The total losses are approaching $300,000. Agent Williams pulled out a map marked with red pins. He starts by identifying undervalued agricultural properties with potential for improvement. Then he finds hard-working partners who will invest their labor and money into developing the land. Once the property value increases, he sells it to unsuspecting buyers and disappears with both the sale proceeds and any loans he's taken out using the improved property as collateral. Helena studied the map with a grim expression. So we're not his first victims. Unfortunately, no. But you might be his last. The evidence you've provided is the most comprehensive we've seen, and your quick action in documenting the fraud has given us the best chance we've had to catch him. Robert felt a mixture of pride and anger. Pride that they'd been smart enough to fight back effectively. Anger that Marcus had been able to victimize so many people before they stopped him. What happens now? Ruth asked. We continue tracking his financial records and current location. He's made mistakes in Wyoming that have left a clearer trail than before. Meanwhile, you need to focus on resolving your immediate situation with the property and debts. After Agent Williams left, the four partners sat around the kitchen table, processing what they'd learned. Marcus's betrayal was even worse than they'd imagined, but knowing they were helping to stop him from hurting others provided some satisfaction. The bank situation is our most pressing concern, Robert said, returning to their practical problems. Even if the FBI recovers some of our money eventually, we need to resolve the loan default before we lose the property. Helena had been thinking about this problem for days. David Chun suggested the bank might be willing to restructure the debt if we can provide a solid business plan and evidence that the property can generate enough income to support reasonable payments. We've got 3 years of agricultural production records, Ruth added. The numbers show steady growth and profitability, especially with the improvements we've made. Robert pulled out the partnership documents he'd been drafting. I've been working on a formal partnership agreement that would give us all legal standing and create a business structure the bank would be comfortable working with. They spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing the proposed partnership terms. Robert would contribute his legal ownership of the property and remain capital. The 3 women would contribute their agricultural expertise, the value of improvements they'd made, and their established relationships with suppliers and buyers. Profits would be shared equally, and major decisions would require unanimous consent. This gives us all protection, Robert explained. No one can sell the property or take on debt without everyone's agreement. And if something happens to one partner, the others have the right of first refusal to buy out their interest. Magdalene reviewed the financial projections Robert had prepared. These numbers look realistic based on our production history. If we can convince the bank to restructure the loan over 5 years instead of demanding immediate payment, we should be able to manage the debt while continuing to grow the business. As evening approached, Robert felt cautiously optimistic for the first time since arriving at the property. They had uncovered Marcus's fraud, provided evidence that could put him in prison, and developed a plan that might save their investments and create something better than any of them could have built alone. There's one more thing we need to discuss, Helena said as they prepared dinner together. If we're going to be partners, we need to be honest about everything, including the fact that we're all attracted to each other. The statement hung in the air, acknowledged but unspoken tension that had been building for days as they worked closely together. Robert felt his pulse quicken as he met each woman's eyes in turn, seeing his own feelings reflected back at him. We don't have to figure everything out tonight, Ruth said quietly. But Helena's right. If we're going to live and work together, we need to acknowledge what's happening between us. Robert nodded, surprised by how natural the conversation felt. I care about all of you. I'm attracted to all of you. I don't know exactly what that means yet, but I know I want to find out. As they sat down to eat the meal they prepared together, Robert realized that what Marcus Vance had intended as a cruel deception might have brought together 4 people who were perfect partners in ways the con man could never have imagined. 2 weeks later, Robert sat in the conference room at First National Bank, flanked by Helena, Ruth, and Magdalene, watching David Chun review their partnership proposal with the bank's loan committee. The formal documents they'd prepared were spread across the mahogany table: agricultural production records, financial projections, the partnership agreement, and a detailed business plan for expanding their operation. The numbers are impressive, admitted Carol Brennan, the bank's senior loan officer. She was a stern woman in her 50s who had initially been skeptical of their unconventional arrangement. Your agricultural production has increased 40% over the past 2 years, and the market analysis shows strong demand for organic produce in this region. Robert felt cautiously hopeful, but he'd been in enough business negotiations to know the decision could go either way. The bank was being asked to restructure a $15,000 loan that Marcus Vance had obtained fraudulently, accepting payment terms that stretched over 5 years instead of demanding immediate settlement. However, Carol continued, and Robert's heart sank at the word. The bank has concerns about the unusual nature of your partnership arrangement. 4 unmarried adults sharing ownership of agricultural property raises questions about long-term stability and decision-making authority. Helena leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. Ms. Brennan, with respect, our personal relationships are not relevant to our business capabilities. The production records speak for themselves, and our partnership agreement clearly outlines decision-making processes and conflict resolution procedures. David Chun, who had been advocating for their proposal within the bank, cleared his throat. Carol, I've reviewed comparable agricultural operations throughout the region. This partnership's productivity and profitability metrics are in the top 10%. Their diversified crop rotation and direct-to-consumer marketing strategy has created multiple revenue streams that actually reduce risk compared to traditional single-family farms. Ruth pulled out a folder of documents. We've also secured letters of intent from 3 major restaurants in Billings and 2 farmers markets guaranteeing purchase of our organic vegetables for the next 2 seasons. This isn't a speculative venture. We have confirmed buyers for our production. Magdalene added, our livestock operation has expanded to include heritage breed cattle that command premium prices. We're not just farming. We're creating a sustainable agricultural business that serves a growing market demand. Carol studied their faces carefully. The financial projections are sound, and your track record is impressive. But what happens if your personal relationships change? If partners decide to leave or if there are conflicts that affect the business? Robert had anticipated this question. Our partnership agreement includes buyout provisions and dispute resolution mechanisms. If any partner wants to leave, the others have the right to purchase their interest at fair market value. If there are irreconcilable conflicts, the property can be sold and proceeds distributed according to each partner's equity stake. Moreover, Helena added, we've been working together successfully for over 2 years. We've already proven we can collaborate effectively under pressure, manage complex agricultural operations, and make difficult decisions together. The loan committee members exchanged glances before Carol spoke again. We need to discuss this privately. Can you give us 30 minutes? As they waited in the bank lobby, Robert felt the tension radiating from his partners. Everything they'd built together depended on the next half hour. If the bank refused to restructure the loan, they would lose the property, regardless of Marcus Vance's fraud. We've done everything we can, Ruth said quietly. The numbers are solid. Our plan is realistic. And we've provided more documentation than most businesses could manage. Helena was pacing near the windows. I hate that our personal lives are even part of this discussion. Would they question a traditional family stability this way? Probably not, Robert admitted. But we knew going into this that our arrangement would face scrutiny. The important thing is that we've proven it works. Magdalene checked her watch. 20 more minutes? I'm trying not to think about what happens if they say no. When David Chen finally called them back into the conference room, Robert couldn't read his expression. Carol Brennan had a document in front of her, but her face remained neutral as they took their seats. The loan committee has reached a decision, Carol began. We're prepared to restructure the Marcus Vance debt under the following conditions. Robert felt his heart stop, waiting for the terms that would determine their future. First, the $15,000 debt will be restructured as a 5-year agricultural development loan at 6% interest, with payments of approximately $320 per month. Ruth squeezed Robert's hand under the table. The monthly payment was well within their projected cash flow. Second, all 4 partners must be listed as personal guarantors for the loan, with the property serving as collateral. That's acceptable, Helena said immediately. Third, the bank requires quarterly financial reports for the first 2 years to ensure the operation remains profitable and stable. We can provide that. Magdalene agreed. Carol smiled for the first time during the meeting. Then congratulations. You've saved your property and created what appears to be a very promising agricultural business. As they shook hands and signed the necessary paperwork, Robert felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he'd been carrying for weeks. They'd not only survived Marcus Vance's betrayal, they'd turned it into an opportunity to build something stronger outside the bank. Helena threw her arms around Robert in a spontaneous hug that quickly included Ruth and Magdalene. For a moment, they stood in a circle on the sidewalk, holding each other and laughing with relief and joy. "We did it," Ruth said, tears streaming down her face. "We actually did it. Marcus Vance tried to destroy us," Magdalene added, "but instead he brought us together." Robert looked at each of his partners, feeling a surge of affection and gratitude that went far beyond business. "What do you say we go home and celebrate?" As they drove back to their property, their shared property now, legally and officially, Robert realized that the word home had taken on a meaning he'd never experienced before. It wasn't just a place anymore. It was these people, this partnership, this life they were building together. That evening, as they sat on the expanded porch watching the sunset over their flourishing fields, Agent Williams called with an update on the Marcus Vance investigation. "We found him," she announced. "He was arrested this morning in Denver, trying to use fake identification to open a bank account. He's being charged with multiple counts of fraud across 4 states. Helena put the phone on speaker so everyone could hear. "What about our money? We've located several bank accounts with significant balances. The recovery process will take time, but we're confident you'll eventually recoup most of your losses. In the meantime, Marcus won't be hurting anyone else. He's looking at 15 to 20 years in federal prison." After the call ended, they sat in comfortable silence, processing the news. Justice was finally being served, and their financial future was secure. "You know what the best part is?" Robert said as stars began to appear in the darkening sky. "What's that?" Ruth asked. "Marcus thought he was so clever, manipulating all of us for his own gain. But his scheme brought together 4 people who are perfect partners in every way that matters." Helena reached for his hand, then for Ruth's and Magdalene's, creating a connection that felt as natural as breathing. "He tried to destroy us individually. Instead, he created something none of us could have built alone." As they headed inside to plan their future together, Robert knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as they had faced Marcus Vance's betrayal, together, with determination, intelligence, and love. 6 months later, Robert stood in the federal courthouse in Helena, Montana, watching Marcus Vance enter the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit and shackles. The man who had seemed so confident and charming when he'd sold Robert the property now looked diminished, his shoulders hunched and his face pale from months in custody. Helena, Ruth, and Magdalene sat beside Robert in the gallery, all 4 of them preparing to deliver victim impact statements at Marcus's sentencing hearing. The FBI's investigation had uncovered an even larger fraud scheme than they'd originally suspected. Marcus had defrauded 17 victims across 5 states, stealing over $400,000 through his elaborate agricultural property scams. "The defendant will rise," Judge Patricia Morrison announced as the hearing began. Robert noticed Helena stiffen slightly at hearing her sister's name, though Judge Morrison had recused herself from any personal involvement in the case. Assistant District Attorney Michael Rodriguez stood to address the court. Your Honor, Marcus Jonathan Vance has pleaded guilty to 14 counts of wire fraud, 12 counts of bank fraud, and 8 counts of identity theft. The prosecution is recommending a sentence of 18 to 22 years in federal prison, with full restitution to victims. Marcus's defense attorney, a tired-looking public defender named James Walsh, rose to present mitigating factors. Your Honor, my client acknowledges the harm he has caused and wishes to express his remorse to the victims. He has cooperated fully with authorities and provided information that led to the recovery of over 60% of the stolen funds. Judge Morrison reviewed the case files before speaking. This court has reviewed the extensive documentation provided by the prosecution, including detailed victim impact statements. Before I pronounce sentence, I will hear from the victims. Mr. Whitmore, you may proceed. Robert stood and approached the podium, his prepared statement in hand. But as he looked at Marcus Vance, who refused to meet his eyes, he decided to speak from the heart instead. Your Honor, 6 months ago, Marcus Vance nearly destroyed my life and the lives of 3 remarkable women who had trusted him. He didn't just steal our money. He stole our faith in human decency and our ability to trust others. Robert paused, looking back at his partners. But what Marcus didn't understand is that good people, when they're brought together by adversity, can create something stronger than what any individual could build alone. His betrayal brought 4 people together who might never have met otherwise. And we've built a partnership, both business and personal, that has exceeded our wildest expectations. He turned back to Marcus, who was still staring at the floor. I want you to know that your scheme failed, Marcus. Not just because you got caught, but because the people you tried to destroy are thriving. We're not victims anymore. We're survivors, and we're stronger than ever. Helena spoke next, her voice clear and strong. Marcus Vance preyed on people who were willing to work hard and trust others. He used our labor and investment to improve properties, then stole the proceeds and left us with nothing but debt and broken promises. She gestured toward Ruth and Magdalene. The 3 of us had invested everything, our savings, our labor, our dreams, into building something meaningful. Marcus treated us like disposable tools to be used and discarded when he found a better opportunity. Her voice grew harder. But we didn't let him win. We fought back, we gathered evidence, and we helped the FBI build a case that will protect other innocent people from his schemes. The sentence you imposed today isn't just about punishing Marcus Vance. It's about sending a message that fraud and betrayal have consequences. Ruth's statement focused on the broader impact of Marcus's crimes. Your Honor, Marcus Vance didn't just steal money. He damaged entire communities. Rural areas depend on trust and cooperation to survive. When someone like Marcus exploits that trust, it makes everyone more suspicious and less willing to help their neighbors. Magdalene delivered the final victim statement, her green eyes blazing with controlled anger. Marcus Vance is a predator who specifically targeted hard-working people trying to build better lives. He studied our weaknesses, gained our trust, and then systematically exploited us for his own gain. She paused, looking directly at Marcus for the first time. I want the court to know that his victims are not weak or naive people who deserved what happened to them. We were competent, experienced individuals who were betrayed by someone we trusted. That makes his crimes even more despicable. When the victim statements were complete, Judge Morrison asked Marcus if he wanted to address the court. He stood slowly, his voice barely audible as he spoke. I want to apologize to everyone I hurt. I know my actions caused terrible harm, and I take full responsibility for my choices. His words sounded rehearsed and hollow, lacking any genuine emotion. Judge Morrison was not impressed. Mr. Vance, This court has rarely seen such a calculated and extensive pattern of fraud. You didn't make one mistake in judgment. You systematically planned and executed a scheme that devastated 17 families and small businesses. She consulted her notes before continuing. The prosecution has provided evidence of meticulous planning, false identities, forged documents, and deliberate psychological manipulation of your victims. This was not a crime of opportunity or desperation. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign of theft and deception. The courtroom was silent as Judge Morrison prepared to announce the sentence. Marcus Jonathan Vance, this court sentences you to 22 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. You are ordered to pay full restitution to all victims in the amount of $412,875. She paused, looking directly at Marcus. I want to be clear about something, Mr. Vance. The victims of your crimes have shown remarkable resilience and strength. They have built new lives and businesses from the wreckage you created. You intended to destroy them, but instead you revealed their true character and brought together people who are now thriving. As Marcus was led away in shackles, Robert felt a sense of closure he hadn't expected. The man who had tried to ruin them was finally facing justice, but more importantly, his scheme had brought together 4 people who had created something beautiful from his attempt at destruction. Outside the courthouse, Agent Williams approached them with final updates on the financial recovery. The FBI has recovered $308,000 from Marcus's various accounts. After legal fees and administrative costs, you should receive approximately $43,000 in restitution within the next few months. Helena shook the agent's hand. Thank you for everything you've done. Without your investigation, Marcus would still be out there hurting other people. Thank you for providing the evidence that made our case possible. Your quick thinking and thorough documentation were crucial to stopping him. As they drove back to their property, Robert reflected on the strange journey that had brought them together. Marcus Vance had intended to exploit and abandon them, but his betrayal had created something he could never have imagined. A partnership based on trust, respect, and genuine love. Do you think Marcus understood what he'd actually done? Ruth asked as they pulled into their driveway. I don't think he's capable of understanding, Magdalene replied. He sees people as objects to be used, not as human beings with their own worth and potential. Helena smiled as she looked at their thriving farm, the expanded buildings and the productive fields that represented their shared labor and dreams. He thought he was so clever, manipulating all of us for his own gain. But the joke's on him. His scheme brought together 4 people who are perfect partners in every way that matters. That evening, as they celebrated the conclusion of their legal ordeal, Robert raised his glass in a toast. To Marcus Vance, the worst con man in history. He tried to destroy us individually, but instead he created something none of us could have built alone. As they clinked glasses under the stars, surrounded by the land they had saved and improved together, Robert knew that justice had been served in more ways than one. Marcus Vance would spend the next 2 decades in prison, but his victims had transformed his betrayal into the foundation of something beautiful and enduring. 1 year after Marcus Vance's sentencing, Robert stood on the same porch where he'd first encountered the 3 women who had changed his life forever. The property had transformed beyond recognition. New buildings housed an expanded livestock operation. Additional greenhouse structures extended their growing season, and solar panels provided clean energy for the entire complex. More importantly, the 4 of them had found a rhythm that worked both professionally and personally. What had started as a desperate partnership to save their investments had evolved into something none of them had dared to imagine. A family. Helena approached from the equipment barn, wiping grease from her hands after servicing the new tractor they purchased with their restitution money from Marcus's crimes. The delegation from the Agricultural Extension Office will be here in an hour, she announced. They want to document our operation as a model for sustainable partnership farming. Robert smiled at the irony. What Marcus Vance had intended as an elaborate fraud had become a legitimate success story that was attracting attention from agricultural professionals across the region. Their innovative partnership structure, combined with their sustainable farming practices, had created an operation that was both profitable and environmentally responsible. Ruth emerged from the greenhouse carrying a basket of organic vegetables destined for their weekly farmers market booth. The university research team wants to study our soil improvement techniques, she said, her face glowing with pride. They think our composting and crop rotation methods could be replicated on farms throughout Montana. Magdalene joined them from the pasture where she'd been checking on their heritage cattle herd. 3 more restaurants in Billings want a contract for our organic beef, she reported. We're going to need to expand the herd again next spring. As they prepared for their visitors, Robert reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought them to this point. The property Marcus had sold him for $47,000 was now worth over $150,000, thanks to the improvements and business development they'd accomplished together. But the financial success was secondary to the personal fulfillment they'd all found. Robert had discovered that sharing his life with 3 remarkable women wasn't just possible, it was more rewarding than any traditional relationship he'd ever experienced. Their arrangement had evolved naturally over the months, without pressure or artificial timelines. Helena's fierce independence and natural leadership had made her his closest partner in business decisions. Ruth's gentle wisdom and innovative thinking had created an emotional bond that felt as natural as breathing. Magdalene's passionate spirit and unwavering loyalty had completed their circle in ways none of them had anticipated. The legal restitution from Marcus's crimes had provided the capital they needed to expand their operation, but it was their combined skills and unwavering commitment to each other that had created their success. They had proven that unconventional partnerships could thrive when built on trust, respect, and shared values. The reporters from the Helena Independent Record will be here this afternoon, Helena mentioned as they reviewed their schedule. They want to do a feature story about alternative agricultural business models. Robert chuckled. What are we going to tell them about our personal arrangement? The truth, Ruth said simply. That 4 people who were brought together by difficult circumstances discovered they could build something better together than any of them could alone. As the morning progressed, Robert found himself amazed by how smoothly their operation ran. Each partner had assumed responsibility for areas that matched their expertise. Helena managed equipment and infrastructure. Ruth handled crop production and soil science. Magdalene oversaw livestock and marketing. And Robert managed finances and business development. But beyond their professional roles, they had created a family structure that provided each of them with emotional support and genuine intimacy. There were no jealousies or competitions, only a deep appreciation for what each person contributed to their shared life. The agricultural Extension Office delegation arrived precisely on time, led by Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a specialist in sustainable farming practices. As they toured the property, her enthusiasm for their innovations was evident. Your integrated approach to agriculture is remarkable, Dr. Walsh commented as Ruth explained their crop rotation system. The combination of traditional farming methods with modern sustainable practices has created yields that exceed conventional operations, while actually improving soil quality. Helena demonstrated the solar-powered irrigation system she designed and installed. We're completely energy independent now, she explained. The solar array provides power for irrigation, lighting, and all our equipment charging needs. Magdalene's presentation on their heritage livestock program impressed the visitors with its combination of historical preservation and economic viability. These heritage breeds are hardier than modern commercial cattle, she explained. They require less intervention, produce higher quality meat, and command premium prices from restaurants focused on sustainable sourcing. As the tour concluded, Dr. Walsh addressed all four partners. What you've created here represents the future of American agriculture: sustainable, profitable, and socially responsible. We'd like to feature your operation in our statewide educational program. That evening, as they sat on their expanded porch watching the sunset over their thriving fields, Robert felt a contentment he'd never experienced in his previous life. The corporate career that had once defined him seemed like a distant memory, replaced by work that was both meaningful and rewarding. Any regrets? Helena asked, echoing the question she'd posed months earlier when their partnership was still fragile and uncertain. Robert looked at each of them and turned these remarkable women who had confronted him with an impossible situation that had turned out to be the answer to questions he hadn't even known he was asking. The conventional life he had planned seemed pale and empty compared to the vivid reality they had created together. Only one, he said, drawing surprised looks from all three. I regret that it took Marcus Vance's betrayal to bring us together. We could have been building this even longer. Their laughter carried across the evening air, the sound of people who had found exactly where they belonged. In a world that demanded conformity, they had chosen connection. In a society that insisted on conventional relationships, they had created their own definition of love and partnership. Ruth reached for his hand, then for Helena's and Magdalene's, creating the circle of connection that had become their evening ritual. Marcus thought he was so clever, she said softly, using people for his own gain, discarding them when they were no longer useful. But he never understood, Magdalene added, that good people, when they're brought together by adversity, can create something stronger than what any individual could build alone. Helena smiled as she looked out over their land, their buildings, their livestock, all tangible evidence of what they had accomplished together. He tried to destroy us individually. Instead, he gave us each other. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Robert knew that whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them as they had faced Marcus Vance's betrayal. Together, with determination, intelligence, and love. The property deed that had once felt so heavy in his hands now represented something far more valuable than legal ownership. It represented a home built on partnership, a business founded on shared values, and a family created by choice rather than chance. In trying to exploit their individual weaknesses, Marcus Vance had unknowingly brought together four people whose combined strengths were greater than the sum of their parts. His intended victims had become partners, survivors, and ultimately, each other's greatest blessing. The farm that was supposed to be empty had become the fullest, most abundant place any of them had ever known.